At 1:23 a.m. on April 26, 1986, a control room in the Soviet Union made a sound no one there had ever heard before. Not a siren. Not a warning bell. A deep, unnatural thud, like the building itself had been punched from beneath the earth. A second later, another. Bigger. Violent. And then, something impossible. The floor vibrates. Panels shake. Lights flicker. Men freeze. And somewhere beyond the concrete walls, a nuclear reactor begins to tear itself apart. Not slowly. Not gracefully. But in a burst of force so sudden that even the laws of their training can't explain it. Then the roof is gone. A column of fire rises into the night sky, bright blue, flickering like a ghost. A strange light, shimmering above the reactor, as if the air itself has turned into electricity. And the people in the nearby city of Pripyat don't run. They step onto balconies. They look out the windows. They point. They watch. Because the Soviet Union has spent decades teaching its people one thing. Everything is under control. But in that moment, nothing is under control. Inside the plant, engineers argue. Some insist the reactor is fine. Some insist it can't be exploded because it isn't supposed to be possible. Others are already vomiting. Their skin already burning. Not from heat. From something invisible. Radiation. And here's the most terrifying part. The first people sent to fight the fire, the firefighters, don't even know what they're walking into. They think it's a normal industrial blaze. They climb onto the roof. They grab hoses. They step onto graphite blocks, still glowing from the reactor core, and unknowingly absorb lethal radiation in minutes. This is the night Chernobyl happened. A disaster made worse by secrecy, by pride, by denial, and by the terrifying speed of physics. And by sunrise, the Soviet Union will be forced to confront a truth it spent its entire existence trying to bury. You can't censor radiation. Welcome back to history told like a real-time thriller. Because tonight's story isn't about ancient empires. It isn't about battlefields. It's about a place that looked ordinary until it became toxic to the entire world. This is Chernobyl. A nuclear disaster so massive, so shocking, and so misunderstood that even the people standing inside the power plant couldn't accept what had happened. And that's what makes this story terrifying. Chernobyl isn't just an explosion. It's a chain reaction of decisions, human decisions, stacked on top of physics. It's a story where people argue while radiation spreads, where officials deny while a city sleeps, where firefighters rush into a blue glow, not knowing the glow is killing them. For the next hour, we're going to walk through this catastrophe minute by minute. We'll start with the Soviet system that produced Chernobyl, the culture of pressure, secrecy, and obedience. Then we'll enter the control room on April 26th. We'll watch the test that wasn't supposed to happen the way it did. We'll see the moment the reactor becomes unstable, and the moment no one can stop what comes next. And we'll follow the aftermath. The denial, the evacuations, the liquidators, the helicopters, the sacrifices, and the long shadow Chernobyl still casts today. Stay until the end, because the most chilling part of this story isn't the explosion. It's the silence afterward. The way a system tried to hide an invisible catastrophe, and how the world found out anyway. To understand why Chernobyl happened, you have to understand the world that built it. The Soviet Union didn't just build power plants. It built symbols. Gigantic projects meant to prove something, that the USSR could outproduce, outbuild, and outlast the West. And nuclear power was the crown jewel of that story. It was modern. It was scientific. It was proof that the future belonged to them. So when the Soviet Union built the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine, it wasn't just an energy project. It was a statement. And beside the plant, they built a model city. Pripyat. Modern apartments. Wide streets. Schools. Parks. A young, educated population. Engineers, technicians, families. Pripyat was meant to be a showcase. A Soviet dream city powered by the atom. But behind the dream was a quiet reality. The Soviet system rewarded success and punished failure, which meant people learned to report good news, And very bad news. They learned to meet quotas, to keep schedules, to avoid embarrassing superiors, to obey. And in that culture, safety could become an inconvenience. Not because people didn't care, but because admitting problems could destroy careers. Now look at the reactor itself. Chernobyl used an RBMK reactor design, a powerful type used widely in the USSR. It had advantages. It could produce large amounts of electricity. It could be refueled while operating. It was efficient, but it also had weaknesses. And here's the part that makes the story chilling. Some of those weaknesses were known. Some were documented. But not everyone knew them, because information about reactor flaws was restricted, classified, controlled. In a system built on secrecy, even safety can become secret. One specific flaw matters more than everything else. At low power, the RBMK could become unstable. And under certain conditions, it could produce a dangerous surge. There were also design issues with control rods, the very devices meant to shut the reactor down. In some scenarios, inserting control rods could temporarily increase reactivity instead of decreasing it. That is the opposite of what people instinctively believe. And if you don't know that, you might do the exact thing that triggers disaster. So you have a reactor with hidden risks, and a system with hidden communication. Now add human pressure. In the Soviet Union, power plants needed to deliver electricity. They needed to meet targets. They needed to show reliability. A delay wasn't just a delay. It was political. So plant managers felt pressure to perform, to comply, to prove competence. And by 1986, Chernobyl had already had warning signs. Minor incidents. Operational issues. Not an apocalypse, but enough to show the reactor wasn't a tame machine. Still, the plant kept running. Pripyat kept living. People rode bicycles. Children played. Couples walked at night. All of them unaware that the plant nearby contained a system where one wrong test, one wrong sequence, one wrong moment of pride could become irreversible. Because nuclear power doesn't forgive mistakes the way other industries do. In most jobs, mistakes cost money. In nuclear physics, mistakes cost time, land, and human bodies. And on the night of April 25th into April 26th, 1986, that unforgiving reality was about to reveal itself. The disaster at Chernobyl didn't begin with an explosion. It began with a routine idea, a safety test, a question that sounds harmless. If the plant loses power, can the reactor still be kept safe? The test was designed to answer a real concern, because if external electricity failed, the reactor's cooling pumps needed power to keep water circulating. Generators could supply that power, but there was a delay before the generators fully activated. So the engineers wanted to know, could the turbine's momentum, its spinning inertia, provide enough electricity during that gap? In other words, could the machine coast just long enough to prevent overheating? It was a legitimate question, but a legitimate question in a flawed system can become fatal. The test had been attempted before. It had failed, and each failure created pressure to succeed, because Soviet culture doesn't reward the phrase, "we couldn't." It rewards the phrase, "we did." So on April 25, 1986, the plant prepares again. Reactor number 4. A massive machine that has been running, producing power. The plan is to lower its output, then run the turbine test during shutdown. But the first domino falls early. The electrical grid controllers in Kiev request that Chernobyl keep producing power longer than scheduled. They need electricity. So the shutdown is delayed. Hours pass. Shift changes happen. A new team takes over the control room, night shift. And this is crucial, because the night shift isn't the top crew. They are competent, but they are not the ones who plan the test. They are inheriting a procedure midstream. They're stepping into a situation already altered by delays, already complicated, already pressured. And in a control room, tiredness is a factor people underestimate, because fatigue changes judgment. Fatigue makes you accept risky decisions faster. Fatigue makes you trust routine instead of analysis. Meanwhile, the reactor is being brought down to low power. But the RBMK design is unstable at low power. And during the reduction, something goes wrong. The power drops too far. Instead of stabilizing around the test level, the reactor collapses to a dangerously low output. Now the operators face a choice: abort the test, or recover power and continue. In a healthy culture, the answer might be simple: abort. But the Soviet system isn't built on aborting. It's built on completing. And the test has already been delayed. Management wants it done. The engineers want results. So the operators begin pulling control rods out, many more than safety rules normally allow, to raise power back up. This is where the room quietly steps into forbidden territory. The reactor becomes more and more unstable. To keep it running, they disable certain automatic safety systems. Not because they want disaster, because the safety systems interfere with the test. And in their minds, they are controlling the reactor. But what they're really doing is stripping away layers of protection. A reactor is like a beast. It can be tamed with safeguards. But if you remove the safeguards, you are no longer riding a beast. You are sitting on its spine. And there is one more deadly factor. As power stays low, a phenomenon called xenon poisoning builds up. Xenon-135 absorbs neutrons and suppresses the reaction. To counter it, operators pull rods out further, which makes the reactor more vulnerable to sudden changes. So now the reactor is in a delicate, unstable state. Low power, control rods withdrawn, safety systems bypassed, xenon poisoning complicating control. And then, at 1:23 a.m. on April 26 the operators begin the test. They close steam valves to the turbine. The turbine begins slowing. Cooling pumps begin losing power. Water flow changes. The reactor's behavior shifts. And in the RBMK design, that shift can mean something terrifying. Less water in the core can mean more reactivity, more power, more heat, more instability. And in the control room, people begin noticing indicators moving in the wrong direction. But by the time they realize how wrong, physics is already accelerating. And the next few seconds will become the most infamous seconds in nuclear history. The control room at Reactor 4 is lit like an office. Fluorescent. Almost ordinary. Men in uniforms and white shirts sit at panels of gauges and switches. They've done this work countless times. They know the sounds of the reactor. They know what normal feels like. So when the numbers begin to move the wrong way, their first instinct isn't panic. It's denial. At 1:23 a.m., the test begins. Steam valves close. The turbine starts to slow. Electricity output drops. Cooling pumps lose power. Water flow changes inside the reactor core. And the RBMK reacts. The operators see the power begin to rise. Not huge at first, but rising. The core heats up. Steam bubbles form in the coolant channels. And in this reactor design, steam bubbles, voids, can make the reaction intensify. That's the terrifying feedback loop. More heat creates more steam. More steam increases reactivity. More reactivity creates more heat. A loop that feeds itself. The indicators jump. Operators exchange looks. Someone calls out numbers. Someone else insists it's fine. Then the rise accelerates. A sharp climb. Like a car going downhill with the brakes failing. In that moment, a crucial decision is made. Someone hits the emergency shutdown button. It's 5. The big red button meant to stop everything. In every nuclear operator's mind, a Z5 is salvation. It means control rods drop into the reactor to absorb neutrons and kill the chain reaction. It's the final wall between instability and catastrophe. So the operator presses a Z5, believing the reactor will calm. But here is the nightmare hidden inside the RBMK design. Because of the control rod tip design, inserting rods can briefly increase reactivity in certain conditions, especially at low power with rods withdrawn. So instead of stopping the surge, a Z5 becomes the trigger. The rods begin to descend. And for a fraction of time, reactivity spikes. The power surges violently upward. Not slowly. Not gradually. Violently. Later estimates suggest it shoots far beyond design limits, possibly hundreds of times normal output. The fuel channels rupture. Water flashes into steam instantly. Pressure builds. Metal bends. The core becomes a bomb. Then it happens. A deep thud. The first explosion. It blows the reactor apart internally. A second explosion follows, larger. The roof lifts. Concrete cracks. The building shakes like it's been struck by an earthquake. Panels jump. Lights flicker. Men fall out of chairs. And then, through broken doors and shattered windows, they see the impossible. A glow outside. Blue and white. Flickering. A column of flame rising into the night. The reactor is open to the sky. But in the control room, disbelief dominates. Because RBMK reactors aren't supposed to explode. Engineers insist it can't be the core. It must be a hydrogen tank. A turbine accident. Something else. Someone says the reactor is intact. Someone says the instruments are lying. Someone says the explosion is outside. And that denial becomes lethal. Because while they argue, radiation is pouring out of the destroyed core. And it's not a small leak. It's a fountain. Graphite blocks, pieces of the reactor core, are ejected onto the roof and ground. They glow like hot charcoal. Fire spreads. And the air carries invisible death. But none of the men in the control room understand that yet. They are still trapped in the mindset of the system. This cannot be happening. Which means their next actions will be based on a false reality. And those actions will cost lives. Outside the plant, the night sky changes color. A strange blue light rises above Reactor 4. It isn't the orange of a normal fire. It's electric. Flickering. Almost beautiful, like the aurora. That glow is radiation ionizing the air. But the people who see it don't know that. They see something rare. Something dramatic. Something worth watching. So in the city of Pripyat, just a few kilometers away, people step outside. They stand on balconies. They point. They whisper. Some even bring their children to watch. Because it looks like a distant industrial accident. A fire. A spectacle. Not an invisible poison cloud. At the plant, alarm calls go out. Firefighters are dispatched. And here is where tragedy becomes unbearable. The firefighters arrive thinking they're responding to a normal emergency. A roof fire. An electrical blaze. Something they've trained for. They don't arrive in hazmat gear. They don't bring radiation protection. They bring hoses. Axes. Courage. The first crews rush toward the flames. They see debris scattered across the ground. Pieces of black material, heavy, strange, glowing faintly. They don't know it's graphite from the reactor core. If they had known, they would have run. Because graphite from a reactor core means only one thing. The core is exposed. A firefighter picks up a chunk. It feels warm. It's oddly smooth. He tosses it aside like a piece of coal. In that moment, he absorbs radiation that is catastrophically high. But he doesn't feel it. Not yet. Because radiation sickness doesn't announce itself immediately. It comes later, like a delayed poison. The firefighters climb onto the roofs to stop the fires spreading to other reactors. They move across tar and debris, stepping over glowing fragments. Some are literally walking on pieces of the destroyed reactor. And still, they don't fully understand. They aim hoses at flames. They shout to each other. They work like heroes. Because they believe heroism will solve it. But nuclear physics doesn't care about heroism. Meanwhile, inside the plant, engineers are still trying to understand what happened. Some insist the reactor is intact. Some order men to pump water into the core. But there is no core to cool. It has been destroyed. There is a crater where a reactor used to be. So the orders become dangerous. Men are sent into areas with lethal radiation. They climb stairwells. They enter corridors. They stand in rooms where the radiation levels are so high that a human body can absorb a fatal dose in minutes. Some of these men will die within days. Not because they were careless. Because they were ordered to act based on denial. And denial is a weapon in a disaster. It makes people walk toward death with confidence. Outside, the firefighters fight for hours. They manage to contain fires on the roof. They prevent flames from spreading to Reactor 3. And in doing so, they save Europe from an even larger catastrophe. But the cost is their bodies. One by one, firefighters begin feeling strange symptoms. A metallic taste. A burning sensation in the throat. Nausea. Weakness. Some begin vomiting. Some faint. Some complain their faces feel like they're on fire. Their skin reddens like sunburn. But it isn't sunburn. It's radiation damage. Inside Pripyat, life continues. People sleep. Because no evacuation has been ordered. No warning has been announced. The Soviet system does not like public panic. Public panic is failure. So officials delay admitting what has happened. And that delay is deadly. Because while people sleep, radioactive particles drift over the city, settling on streets, on playgrounds, on laundry hanging outside. And by morning, children will walk through a city that has been quietly contaminated. This is the second tragedy of Chernobyl. Not just the explosion, but the silence afterward. The silence of a system that doesn't know how to say, "We have lost control." Morning comes to Pripyat like it always does. Sunlight hits the apartment blocks. Buses begin running. Children walk toward school. Women step outside to shake rugs from balconies. Men head to work. And in the distance, the power plant still burns. But the smoke looks almost normal. A dark column rising into the bright sky. From far away, it's just an industrial accident. A fire. A mess that the Soviet state will handle quietly. That is what people have been trained to believe. Everything is under control. Even when it isn't. At the plant, the reality is more terrifying. The reactor is gone. The core is exposed. And radiation levels in parts of the facility are so high they fry instruments. Some meters max out. Some give false readings because they can't handle the intensity. But the people in charge, plant leadership, local officials, are still struggling with the same mental barrier. Reactor explosions aren't supposed to happen. So they search for explanations that fit the world they know. A hydrogen explosion, they say. A fire, they said. A manageable situation. And because they want it to be manageable, they behave as if it is. That's the Soviet reflex. Contain, minimize, deny. Workers are ordered to go where no one should go. To inspect damage. To open valves. To pump water. To handle debris. Some of them obey without understanding the danger. Some of them obey because refusal is unthinkable. And some of them obey because they believe the danger is exaggerated. After all, radiation is invisible. You can't see it. You can't smell it. You can't feel it immediately. So it's easy to pretend it isn't real. Meanwhile, the first responders, the firefighters, are beginning to break down. In hospital rooms, men who were healthy hours earlier are now vomiting uncontrollably. Their faces swell. Their skin reddens. They complain of intense thirst, splitting headaches, burning eyes. Some develop blisters that look like severe burns. But they weren't burned by flame. They were burned by radiation. Doctors in the nearby medical clinics are confused. Because acute radiation sickness isn't something most of them have treated. They don't have the tools. They don't have the protective gear. They don't have the training. And at first, even they don't fully understand what they're seeing. Then there's the city, Pripyat, a place designed to feel modern, safe, bright, confident. On April 26th, people walk beneath trees, breathe in spring air, and feel strangely metallic tastes in their mouths. Some feel nausea. Some feel headaches. Some feel irritation in the throat and eyes. But they shrug it off. Cold, they think. Stress. They look toward the plant and see the smoke rising. Some even go closer. They walk to a bridge to get a better view. The place that will later be called, by survivors, something like a death bridge. Because the wind carries radioactive particles, and those particles settle invisibly on their hair and clothing. And still, there are no warnings. No sirens. No announcements. The Soviet system does not like uncertainty. It does not like chaos. So it delays. It waits for higher authority. It waits for confirmation. And in disasters, waiting can be fatal. Local party officials contact Moscow. Plant officials send reports. But the reports are often incomplete, confused, softened, because admitting the full truth, an exploded nuclear reactor, feels unthinkable. It feels like treason against the idea of Soviet competence. Then something happens that forces reality to leak out. Radiation monitors beyond the plant begin detecting abnormal levels. Not just in Pripyat, beyond it. And soon, across the border, in places far away, alarms begin going off. In Sweden, technicians at a nuclear plant detect radioactive contamination on their workers. Contamination that does not come from Sweden. They begin asking questions. Where is this coming from? The world starts realizing something is happening inside the Soviet Union. Something big. Something the USSR is not announcing. And now the Soviet leadership faces a dilemma that defines the entire Chernobyl story. Tell the truth and cause panic. Or hide the truth and increase damage. Inside the USSR, the instinct is to hide. Because secrecy is survival in that system. But the physics of radiation doesn't care about political instinct. Radiation spreads whether you admit it or not. And as the day moves forward, pressure grows. Military units arrive. Scientists arrive. Officials arrive from Moscow. They stand near the plant, staring at the ruined reactor, and some of them finally understand. This is not a fire. This is a crater of invisible death. But even then, the scale is hard to accept. Because the scale is beyond human intuition. A nuclear reactor doesn't explode like a bomb and stop. It burns. It releases contamination constantly. And the core, exposed, continues throwing radioactive materials into the atmosphere. So now the next decision becomes urgent. What do you do when a reactor is open to the sky? How do you extinguish something that isn't just fire? How do you stop a chain of reactions in melted fuel and graphite? How do you protect a city that is already contaminated? And the most chilling part is this. Even now, Pripyat remains full of people. Children playing. Families shopping. Life continuing under an invisible storm. Because no one has told them what the air contains. No one has told them what the dust on their shoes means. No one has told them that the danger is not the smoke they see, but the poison they can't. This is the build-up. The morning after the explosion. A city living normally while the invisible spreads. A government delaying the truth. And first victims collapsing with symptoms that seem impossible. And somewhere behind all of it, a silent clock is ticking. Because every hour of delay means more exposure, more contamination, more lives changed forever. By the afternoon of April 26th, the situation is no longer something officials can rationalize away. Scientists arriving from Moscow begin taking measurements. They walk near the plant, checking levels. And their faces change. Because now the numbers are undeniable. Radiation is not elevated. It is catastrophic. High enough in places to kill quickly. High enough to contaminate everything it touches. High enough that the city of Pripyat, still full of families, has already been exposed for hours. And yet, the evacuation does not happen immediately. Because evacuation is a political act. It's an admission that something has gone wrong on a scale the Soviet Union does not want the world to see. It's also a logistical nightmare. Pripyat has nearly 50,000 people. You can't just whisper leave. You need buses. You need routes. You need a plan. And the Soviet system is built to appear calm, even when it's panicking behind closed doors. So while children play in parks, while people shop, while couples stroll past the river, officials in rooms behind heavy doors argue. Some push for evacuation. Some resist. They worry about chaos. They worry about embarrassment. They worry about Moscow's reaction. And while they debate, radiation keeps drifting. Settling on trees. On sidewalks. On playground swings. On the laundry hanging outside. There is a moment in every disaster where silence becomes its own crime. Chernobyl has that moment. Because by now, the people of Pripyat are not just living near danger. They are living inside it. Still, the city remains strangely calm. Many residents see the smoke and glow from a distance and assume the fire is being handled. The Soviet state has always handled things. Or at least, that's the story. But inside hospitals, the story is cracking. Firefighters are collapsing. Plant workers are collapsing. Doctors begin noticing the same pattern: vomiting, weakness, burns that don't make sense. And the word radiation begins spreading in whispers. Quietly. Not publicly. Because even the word itself feels forbidden. Then, late on April 26th and into April 27th, the order finally comes. Evacuate Pripyat. But even that order is wrapped in calm language. Not an alarm. Not a warning. A controlled announcement. A message designed to prevent panic. Loudspeakers begin speaking across the city. And people stop walking. They listen. They hear something like this. A temporary evacuation. A precaution. 3 days. Bring documents. Bring essential items. Leave pets. Lock your doors. Return soon. And that phrase, 3 days, is the most heartbreaking lie the city will ever hear. Because many families believe it. They pack small bags. They bring some food. A jacket. A toy for a child. They look around their apartments and think, we'll be back. So they leave behind photographs, furniture, wedding gifts, everything that makes a home. They leave behind curtains still moving slightly in the open window. They leave behind meals half prepared. They leave behind the normal mess of everyday life. Because nobody can emotionally accept leaving forever in a single afternoon. Buses arrive in long lines. Hundreds of them. The streets fill with engines and voices. People gather, confused but compliant. Some ask questions. Officials give vague reassurance. The Soviet state is good at reassurance. It is not good at honesty. Children climb onto buses holding parents' hands. Elderly people move slowly, carrying small bundles. Teenagers joke nervously, trying to turn fear into humor. And soldiers stand nearby, watching. As if the city itself is now a controlled zone. As the buses roll out, residents look back at Pripyat. A modern Soviet dream city, still beautiful in the spring sunlight. Trees blooming. Buildings standing. No obvious sign that the place is poisoned. That's what makes it surreal. An evacuation without visible threat. Like leaving because of a ghost. Some people even smile, thinking this is temporary. But others feel something deeper. A wrongness. A heaviness. A sense that the air itself has changed. Because rumors are growing now. Some have heard whispers from plant workers. Some saw the strange blue glow at night. Some heard that firefighters were burned from the inside. And as the buses cross the bridge out of the city, the reality begins to settle. If it's truly safe, why are there so many soldiers? Why so many buses? Why the urgency? The evacuation becomes a strange, silent procession. A city being emptied in hours. A place being abandoned while the buildings remain intact. And the cruelest detail is what they're told to leave behind. Pets. Dogs barking from balconies. Cats peering through windows. Animals waiting at doors as families walk away. Because the announcement is designed for order, not emotion. And for many evacuees, that image becomes unforgettable. The moment where temporary begins to feel permanent. By nightfall on April 27th, Pripyat is almost empty. A modern city turned into a ghost city. The rides at the amusement park never used. The Ferris wheel never filled with laughter. Streets quiet except for military vehicles. And the silence is now different. Not normal silence. The silence of abandonment. But the worst truth is this. Even evacuation doesn't end the crisis. Because the reactor is still burning. Still releasing radiation. Still poisoning the region. And now the Soviet Union is facing a question that becomes almost impossible. How do you stop a nuclear disaster that won't stop? Once Pripyat is evacuated, the disaster enters its second act. Because the explosion was only the beginning. Now the Soviet Union faces an impossible enemy. A nuclear reactor that is open to the sky. The core, shattered, still burns. Graphite still glows. Fuel still melts. and radiation continues to rise into the air like invisible smoke. The first priority becomes containment. Stop the release. Stop the fire. Stop the core from melting deeper into the building. And above all, prevent a second disaster. Because inside the destroyed reactor building, there are still massive reservoirs of water. Water used in cooling systems. Water in suppression pools. If the molten nuclear fuel, corium, melts downward and hits water, it could trigger a violent steam explosion. Another blast. Another release. Possibly worse. And that fear becomes obsession. Scientists and engineers in Moscow understand something terrifying. This could spiral beyond Ukraine, beyond the Soviet Union, beyond anything the modern world has ever faced. So they mobilize. They send soldiers. They send engineers. They send miners. They send men whose job is to enter a place where every second reduces their lifespan. These men will become known as liquidators. A chilling word. It doesn't mean helpers. It means people sent to liquidate the consequences, to erase evidence, to contain contamination, to fight an invisible enemy. And many of them will do it at the cost of their bodies. The first dramatic effort begins from the air. Helicopters fly over Reactor 4. Pilots stare down into a crater glowing with heat and radiation. They can't fly too low. The radiation can damage instruments. It can disorient them. But they must drop materials into the open core. Sand to smother fire. Boron to absorb neutrons. Lead to block radiation. Clay. Dolomite. Everything they can. So helicopters approach, hover, and dump heavy sacks into the burning mouth of the reactor. It's like trying to extinguish a volcano by throwing rocks into it. Some drops miss. Some burst in midair. Some scatter radioactive dust. Pilots fly again and again. Their exposure accumulates. And each flight becomes a gamble. Because the air above the reactor isn't just hot. It's poisoned. Meanwhile, on the ground, another nightmare unfolds. The roofs of nearby buildings are covered in radioactive debris. Graphite blocks. Fragments of fuel. Pieces of the reactor itself. And those fragments are still emitting intense radiation. So the debris must be cleared. It cannot remain, because it continues contaminating everything around it. At first, they use machines, robots. But the radiation is so intense that many robots fail. Their electronics break down. They stop moving. They become useless. So humans are sent instead. Men in protective gear. Sometimes barely adequate. They are given a simple mission. Run onto the roof. Shovel debris. Throw it off. Run back. And they are given strict time limits. Because staying too long means lethal doses. Some men have 90 seconds. Some have less. They sprint across the roof. They grab chunks of debris with shovels. They throw them over the edge. They run back, breathing hard, feeling nothing at first, but absorbing invisible damage. The roof becomes a battlefield. Not against bullets. Against time. Against radiation. And the men who do this later describe it as the most terrifying thing they've ever done. Because you can't fight what you can't see. Every step is risk. Every second is danger. And still, the Soviet system frames it as duty. As heroism. As sacrifice for the motherland. And many liquidators believe it. They volunteer. Or they obey. Or they are told this is their mission. And in a system built on obedience, refusal is rare. While this cleanup happens, another crisis grows beneath the reactor. Remember the water. Remember the fear of a second explosion. If molten fuel reaches the water reservoirs, it could flash into steam and blast radioactive material upward again. So engineers decide they must drain the water. But draining it requires access to dangerous areas under the reactor building. So 3 men are selected to enter. They go into flooded corridors, in darkness, with radiation rising. They wade through water. They search for valves. Their flashlights cut through blackness. And for a long time, the world believed these men died shortly after. But later accounts suggest they survived the immediate mission, though their exposure was still severe. The point is not the myth. The point is the reality. Men were sent into places where they might not return, because the alternative was a second disaster. Now, if that isn't tense enough, another fear emerges. The core continues melting, and scientists begin worrying about the molten fuel melting downward into the earth. They fear it could contaminate groundwater or destabilize the site. So a new plan is formed: build a cooling system beneath the reactor. And to do that, they bring miners, hundreds of them. They dig beneath Reactor 4, in suffocating heat, in dangerous conditions, sometimes working shirtless because of the temperature. They dig a tunnel, racing against time, because no one knows how fast the molten fuel is moving. This becomes another kind of horror, a race between human labor and nuclear physics. And in the middle of this, leadership battles continue. Soviet officials still fear admitting full scale. They still fear international humiliation. They still fear panic. But the outside world is now noticing. Radiation has been detected in Europe. Governments ask questions. And the Soviet Union is forced, reluctantly, to acknowledge something has happened. But even then, the first public statements are small, minimized, controlled. They speak as if the situation is limited, contained. But inside the exclusion zone, nothing feels contained. It feels like a war zone. Soldiers spraying roads with chemicals. Workers washing buildings. Helicopters thundering overhead. People in masks. Signs warning of danger. Geiger counters clicking like insects. And the land itself begins to feel cursed. Because the enemy is everywhere. On clothing. On soil. On leaves. In dust. Even in the bones of animals. And the psychological weight is crushing. Because for the liquidators, the danger isn't a dramatic moment. It's constant exposure. And you can't feel exposure. You only feel it later when your body begins to betray you. That is what makes Chernobyl so uniquely terrifying. The catastrophe is invisible. Until it isn't. Until your skin blisters. Until your stomach revolts. Until your organs begin failing. Until you realize the enemy was inside you all along. By the time this phase is underway, the Soviet Union has become locked in a desperate containment mission. And the world is watching, even if the Soviet media tries to downplay it. Because radiation doesn't respect borders. It doesn't care about ideology. It doesn't care about secrecy. It moves with wind. It settles with rain. It leaves fingerprints in faraway places. And as the days pass, one truth becomes unavoidable. Chernobyl isn't just a Soviet accident. It's a global event. And now the question becomes, can they contain it before it becomes worse? The Soviet Union was built on a promise. A promise that the state could control reality. Control information. Control narrative. Control what people believed. And for decades, that promise worked, at least on the surface. But Chernobyl introduced something the Soviet system could not control. Because you can't imprison the wind. You can't interrogate a cloud. You can't censor radiation. In the first hours after the explosion, officials tried to keep everything contained. They controlled the news. They kept the phones quiet. They treated the disaster like an internal embarrassment. But then, the outside world began to feel it. Not as a headline. As a detection. In Sweden, hundreds of miles away, workers at a nuclear power plant arrived for their shift. They walked through radiation detectors, routine security checks. And alarms started going off. At first, Swedish officials thought it was their own plant. A leak. An accident. No leak. No malfunction. So they tested again. And again the result came back. Radiation. But not from Sweden. From somewhere else. Something was drifting in from the east. The Swedish government began calling the Soviet Union. Asking direct questions. Do you have a nuclear incident? At first, the Soviets denied. Or they answered vaguely. But Sweden kept pushing. Because the evidence was literally on their workers' clothing. Then other countries began detecting it too. Finland. Germany. Poland. Across Europe, radiation readings climbed. And suddenly, the Soviet Union faced an impossible situation. The world already knew something was wrong. Even if the Soviet public didn't. So the Soviet leadership, already panicking internally, was forced into a decision: admit or be exposed. And that's when the twist of Chernobyl hits. Because the disaster doesn't just damage a reactor, it damages the Soviet myth of competence. It reveals that the system's greatest weakness isn't technology. It's truth. The USSR finally issues a brief statement. Controlled. A minor accident, they imply. A fire. An incident. But anyone with a radiation map can see this is not minor. The cloud is spreading. So the international pressure rises. And behind closed doors, Soviet leadership scrambles. They send commissions. They send the KGB. They send ministers. They demand reports. They demand answers. And in classic Soviet fashion, the immediate instinct is not transparency. It's blame. Because this fulfilled. Who will be punished? Because punishment is how the system maintains control. If there is a disaster, someone must be guilty. Not a design flaw. Not systemic pressure. Not culture. A person. So the narrative begins forming. This was operator error. This was incompetence. This was a few individuals violating procedures. And there's truth in that. Operators did violate protocols. But the deeper truth is bigger and more dangerous. The system itself created the conditions. The RBMK design had vulnerabilities. The safety culture was weak. Information about flaws was restricted. Pressure to complete tasks was constant. And in that environment, disaster wasn't just possible. It was waiting. Chernobyl becomes the moment where reality punches through propaganda. Because Soviet citizens begin hearing rumors. They see soldiers. They see evacuees. They see roadblocks. They see helicopters. And they begin asking questions the system can't answer without admitting failure. Mothers wonder why their children are suddenly being given iodine. People wonder why the city is being emptied. And as the Soviet state tries to control the message becomes uncontrollable. Even within the USSR, information starts slipping. Whispers grow louder. The truth becomes impossible to contain. This is the turning point. Because after Chernobyl, the Soviet Union can no longer pretend the state is infallible. It can no longer claim that secrecy equals safety. People begin to understand the danger of silence. And leaders begin to understand something else. A system that hides disasters creates bigger disasters. Chernobyl becomes a crack in the Soviet foundation. Not the only crack, but one of the most visible. And once a crack becomes visible, people start looking for others. And now the story shifts again. Because the next phase isn't just cleanup. It's sacrifice on a scale the world rarely sees. An entire army of liquidators. Men ordered into contaminated zones. Families permanently displaced. Land abandoned for generations. And a final question that will define the rest of the story. How do you bury something that can poison the future? To understand the climax of Chernobyl, you have to understand what the Soviet Union did next. It didn't just fight a fire. It fought time. It fought contamination. It fought the future. Because a burning reactor doesn't just kill today. It poisons tomorrow. So the Soviet state mobilized an army. Not soldiers with rifles, but liquidators with shovels, hoses, and human bodies. Hundreds of thousands of people would eventually be involved. And the terrifying truth is this. Many of them were never fully told what they were walking into. They were told it was dangerous, yes, but not always how dangerous. Sometimes because officials didn't know. Sometimes because officials didn't want panic. Sometimes because the system believed duty was enough. They arrive at the exclusion zone and see a landscape that feels like a different planet. Roads sprayed down. Trees dusted with invisible poison. Abandoned villages. Animals wandering without owners. Military checkpoints. Men in masks. Geiger counters clicking constantly, like the air is alive. And above everything, the ruined Reactor 4. A destroyed building with a burning heart. One of the most intense missions is on the roof. The roof of nearby structures, especially the roof of Reactor 3's building and adjacent areas, is covered in radioactive debris. Graphite blocks. Fuel fragments. Pieces of the core. Each piece is a tiny lighthouse of death. The radiation levels up there are so high that even standing still can be fatal. The Soviets try using robots. But the robots fail. The electronics die. They freeze. They collapse. So the state does what it often does when technology fails. It sends people. They are given lead aprons. Some have basic protection. Some have almost nothing that can truly shield them. They are told to run, to shovel, to throw debris off the roof, and to return quickly. They are treated like human machines. Some of them have 90 seconds. Some less. They sprint onto the roof, the wind whipping around them, and the sound of the Geiger counters is no longer clicking. It's roaring, like static. They grab debris with shovels. They throw it over the edge. Some pieces are heavy. Some are stuck. Some are glowing. The men feel fear like electricity. Then they run back, hearts pounding, believing they have survived. But survival is deceptive. Because radiation doesn't kill like a bullet. It kills like a sentence that begins now and ends later. And many of these men will carry the consequences quietly. Health issues. Organ damage. Cancers. Their bodies becoming battlegrounds in slow motion. And yet, without them, the contamination would have remained, spreading further. So the climax becomes an impossible moral equation. How many lives do you sacrifice? To reduce future deaths? This equation repeats everywhere at Chernobyl. Helicopter pilots fly through radiation to drop sand, boron, and lead into the open core. They fly again and again. Some receive high doses. Some pilots later report nausea, weakness, strange symptoms. They do it because the core must be smothered. Then miners dig beneath the reactor. Because scientists fear the molten fuel could melt downward. They dig tunnels in intense heat. Sometimes shirtless. Sometimes working like men trapped inside an oven. They dig to install a cooling system or protective barrier, depending on evolving plans. And again, their exposure accumulates. They do it because the alternative feels worse. Then there is the building of the sarcophagus. A massive concrete and steel structure designed to entomb Reactor 4. The goal is to contain what remains. To lock it away. To stop the constant release. But building it is like building a tomb while the corpse is still toxic. Workers must operate near high radiation zones. They must work quickly. They must improvise. They must accept that this structure is not perfect, but it is necessary. So the Soviet Union builds a monument to containment. Not because the disaster is solved, but because it must be buried. And here is the emotional peak. As this happens, people begin realizing the true scale. Entire communities are displaced. Not for days. Not for weeks. For life. Families are moved into new apartments. Farmers lose land that has been in their families for generations. Villages vanish from the map. The exclusion zone expands. And the Soviet state begins quietly relocating thousands, then tens of thousands, then more. And still, many citizens don't get a clear explanation. Because explanation would require truth. And truth is risky in a system built on secrecy. So Chernobyl becomes a wound that cannot be publicly processed. People are sick, but not allowed to speak openly about why. People are displaced, but not allowed to discuss what they lost. People are terrified, but told everything is safe. This creates a second kind of damage. Psychological damage. Distrust. Paranoia. The sense that the state has lied. And once people believe the state has lied about something this big, they begin to question everything else. The climax, then, is not just the firefighting. It's the human cost. The sacrifice. The knowledge that the Soviet Union is using bodies to contain a catastrophe its own system helped create. This is why Chernobyl becomes more than a disaster. It becomes a symbol. A symbol of what happens when secrecy meets physics. A symbol of what happens when a system values appearance over safety. And as the sarcophagus rises around the ruined core, the world watches a civilization trying to bury an invisible monster. But the monster doesn't vanish. It waits. Inside concrete. Inside soil. Inside memories. And the people who fought it, the liquidators, become the face of a tragedy that continues long after the flames are gone. By the time the fires are contained, Chernobyl has already changed the world. Not in a dramatic cinematic way. In a quiet, irreversible way. Because nuclear disasters don't end when smoke clears. They end when generations pass. And even then, the memory remains. The first impact is human. Pripyat never reopens. A city of nearly 50,000 people becomes a ghost. Apartments are left with toys on the floor. Books open on tables. Curtains still hanging. Time frozen. Families are relocated, scattered into unfamiliar places, forced to rebuild life with what they carried on a bus. Some never feel a home again. The second impact is political. Chernobyl exposes the weakness of the Soviet system to the world. Not just the technical failure. The failure of transparency. The failure of trust. The failure to protect its own citizens with truth. And inside the USSR, Chernobyl becomes gasoline on an already burning fire. People lose faith. They question authority. They see that the state can hide something deadly. This contributes to the broader crisis of legitimacy in the final years of the Soviet Union. Historians debate how much Chernobyl accelerated the USSR's collapse. But few doubt that it shook public confidence deeply. It became a symbol of systemic rot. The third impact is global. Nuclear power, once marketed as clean modern progress, suddenly becomes associated with catastrophe. Countries reconsider safety. Regulations change. New international monitoring systems become more serious. The nuclear industry doesn't vanish, but its public perception changes forever. Chernobyl becomes the word people use as shorthand for nuclear fear. The fourth impact is medical and environmental. Radiation spreads across Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, and parts of Europe. The most infamous early health consequence is thyroid cancer, particularly linked to radioactive iodine exposure among children. Long-term health effects are complex, debated, and difficult to measure precisely. Because radiation, stress, displacement, and delayed medical systems all overlap. But what isn't debated is that a large population was exposed. And the psychological toll is enormous. Fear of contamination. Stigma attached to evacuees. Communities struggling with anxiety and uncertainty. Chernobyl didn't just damage bodies. It damaged identity. For many survivors, Chernobyl becomes a label they carry. Then there's the exclusion zone itself. A region of abandoned villages and forests. In some ways, nature returns. Wildlife moves in. Trees reclaim buildings. But the land remains contaminated in ways that don't always show. You can walk through a forest that looks alive and still be standing on radioactive soil. That paradox becomes the perfect metaphor for Chernobyl. Normal on the surface, danger beneath. And then, decades later, the original sarcophagus begins to degrade. So the world builds a new containment structure. The new safe confinement. A massive arch designed to cover the old sarcophagus and contain the reactor remains for the long term. A reminder that Chernobyl is not a finished story. It's an ongoing responsibility. And that responsibility is the final resolution. Because the true end of Chernobyl isn't in 1986. It's in the continued effort to manage what the explosion created. A disaster that outlives the country that built it. And as the years pass, the lesson becomes clearer. Nuclear power demands transparency. It demands safety culture. It demands humility. Because physics does not negotiate. And Chernobyl proves that the cost of secrecy can be measured not just in lives, but in trust, in nations, in history. Chernobyl happened in 1986, but it still feels like a story about the present. Because the heart of Chernobyl isn't Soviet. It's human. It's the collision of complex systems and human psychology. The first modern lesson is about denial. In the control room, after the explosion, people insisted the reactor was intact. Not because they were stupid, because the mind struggles to accept an event that feels impossible. And organizations do the same thing. When a system fails in an unprecedented way, the first reaction is often This can't be happening. So they delay. They wait. They soften the message. They protect the institution. But in crises, denial is deadly. Because reality keeps moving even when you refuse to name it. The second lesson is about secrecy. The Soviet Union's instinct was to control information, to prevent panic, to protect reputation. But secrecy doesn't prevent harm. It transfers harm. It shifts the cost from the institution to the public. Because when people don't have the truth, they can't protect themselves. They walk through contamination. They drink contaminated milk. They let children play outside. And by the time the truth arrives, the exposure has already happened. Modern societies face the same temptation. Whether it's industrial accidents, public health crises, cyber attacks, or environmental disasters. Leaders often fear panic more than they fear delay. But Chernobyl shows that delayed truth is often worse than immediate truth. The third lesson is about system complexity. Chernobyl didn't happen because one person was evil. It happened because of flawed design, pressured culture, poor communication, and human error aligned. That's how modern disasters happen. Plane crashes, bridge collapses, financial crises, blackouts. They rarely come from one cause. They come from multiple small failures stacking together until the system collapses. And the more complex a society becomes, the more vulnerable it becomes to cascades. That's why Chernobyl matters. It's not just nuclear history. It's a warning about how fragile modern systems can be when accountability is weak. The fourth lesson is about trust. After Chernobyl, many Soviet citizens stopped believing the state. Because if the state could lie about something that could poison their children, what else could it lie about? Trust is hard to build and easy to lose. And modern societies run on trust. Trust in institutions. Trust in data. Trust in safety. Trust in communication. When that trust collapses, the damage spreads beyond the original event. It becomes political, social, psychological. Chernobyl also teaches that heroism can exist inside broken systems. The firefighters, the plant workers who tried to control the chaos, the liquidators who cleared debris, the miners who dug tunnels. Many of them were ordinary people. They didn't fully understand the danger, but they showed up anyway. And their sacrifice reduced the disaster scale. That's an uncomfortable truth. Systems fail. But individuals can still save lives inside failure. And finally, Chernobyl teaches humility. Because nuclear power isn't inherently evil. But it demands respect. It demands safety culture. It demands transparency. And Chernobyl is what happens when pride and secrecy enter a field where physics is absolute. You can argue with people. You can intimidate subordinates. You can manipulate media. But you cannot negotiate with neutrons. So even today, Chernobyl stands as a symbol, not just of Soviet failure, of human vulnerability, a reminder that modern life depends on systems we rarely understand, and that safety depends on honesty. And that was Chernobyl, the night the reactor exploded, and the world learned a terrifying truth. Some disasters don't end with smoke. They end with silence, with invisible consequences, with cities abandoned, with lives altered quietly, permanently, and with questions that never fully go away. If you enjoyed this kind of immersive, suspenseful history storytelling, where every decision feels like a countdown, make sure you subscribe, because we're going deeper into the moments where civilization nearly breaks, and the people who were trapped inside them. Next, we're telling a story that also began with a system failing, and ended with the world changing. A ship called the Titanic, a night of ice, arrogance, and panic in the Atlantic, and a disaster that wasn't just about sinking, it was about who got to live. If you want that 1-hour story, subscribe now. And if you made it all the way through Chernobyl, comment the word Chernobyl. I read the comments. And it tells me you want more long-form history thrillers where the danger feels real, because it was.